Francis buried his wife a week ago, but he still couldn't believe what happened or come to terms with the bitterness of the loss. Every time the inconsolable husband thought about it, tears welled up in his eyes. Meanwhile, his little son Richie kept asking him the same question. "Dad, where's Mom? Will she come back soon? Why did she leave us?" Francis would have gladly given up anything in the world to turn back time and save Linda. Of course, he was well aware that it was impossible, and things like that could only happen in movies. Going through an old photo album, Francis was mentally transported to the recent past, when he was happy, enjoying life with his wife. He met Linda by accident, and if it weren't for her broken heel, it might have never happened. But it did. Linda stumbled and sprained her ankle. At that moment, a tall guy who was passing by grabbed her by the arm. By a strange coincidence, Linda's savior turned out to be none other than Francis, who worked as a manager in a trading company. That day, he was running late for work, and if it weren't for the strange set of circumstances, he might have never met Linda. But everything turned out the way that it did, and Francis never once regretted that he got to meet his future wife thanks to this amazing coincidence. The young people got married very soon, having only dated for about 3 months by that time. The first problem Francis and Linda had to deal with was their inability to have children. Nothing seemed to help them. Neither the countless tests of various medical institutions nor the expensive treatment had any effect on their situation. After 4 years of unsuccessful attempts, Linda and Francis lost all hope and started talking about adoption. But that's when the real miracle happened. The pregnancy test was finally positive. It was one of the most important days in the couple's life. Linda experienced morning sickness and dizziness throughout the pregnancy, but she kept it to herself and never complained to her husband about it. Francis took great care of his wife, trying to protect her from all kinds of stress or strenuous activities. Linda was most afraid of having a difficult labor, but it turned out to be surprisingly easy and painless. Having given birth to their beautiful son Richie, Linda made her husband a truly unforgettable and precious gift. Richie was growing up as a smart and quiet boy, never ceasing to make his parents proud with his little achievements. Their son's first steps, his first word, and the first drawing he made. All these milestones filled the life of Linda and Francis with true happiness. Everything was going well until Richie turned 5 years old and Linda bought a used car. If Francis could have only known what it would lead to, he would have never allowed his wife to drive it. It all ended as suddenly as it began. One day, Linda's car was found outside the city. Her body was found in the driver's seat. Judging by the bruises and lacerations on her face, she was a victim of a robbery. Despite the large-scale search operation, the police never managed to find her attacker. Upon learning of what had happened, Francis couldn't believe that Linda had died. God, even those words sound crazy. Who would want to kill my wife? What robbery? What could they get from my housewife driving around in a used car? Francis felt that there was something more to Linda's mysterious death, something that at first glance seemed insignificant to everyone else. The funeral and the wake turned into one big pile of pain and suffering for the young widower. Richie constantly cried and called for his mother, but Francis knew that Linda would never come home. One day, looking to distract himself and his son, the man took an oblong box out of the closet. It had a miniature video camera intended for covert surveillance. Once upon a time, Francis bought it at a discount price, planning to use it to observe animals and birds in the local park. But the young widower no longer felt like watching wildlife. Instead, he decided to install the camera on the grave of his late wife. If Francis were asked about his motives, he wouldn't be able to provide a definitive answer. Most likely, Francis was simply very sad about the fact that his wife had passed and he would never get to see her again. Since the camera was equipped with its own battery, it could continue filming for several days. Having installed it in secret from his son, Francis stared at the screen of his laptop, watching the live stream from the surveillance camera. As one would expect, Francis didn't see anything interesting at first. The dull view of the city cemetery evoked melancholy and sadness. And even watching it from the comfort of his home, the man couldn't hold back his tears. Francis looked at the grave of his beloved wife and still couldn't come to terms with what had happened. That's life for you. You raise your kids, make plans for the future, and then one day it's all gone in an instant, as if it were never there, Francis whispered. During the day, nothing ever changed in the footage transmitted by the camera, so despite Francis's utmost desire to see something interesting there, he couldn't find anything. But when dusk fell over the city and the night came to take over the reins of life, Francis decided to take a look at Linda's grave in the moonlight. The camera had automatically switched to night shooting mode, which made the image clear enough to see what was happening there. It was a truly captivating view. The even rows of graves, marbled tombstones, and moss-covered old scripts looked both creepy and beautiful under the light of the moon. Suddenly, something appeared on the screen that made Francis flinch. A woman approached Linda's grave. In the moonlight, her face seemed very familiar to Francis. Looking more closely, the man shuddered and started rubbing his eyes in surprise, thinking that he might have dozed off and was seeing a dream. But Francis didn't fall asleep, and he wasn't dreaming. The woman on the screen was very much real. But the most shocking part wasn't the fact that some woman came to Linda's grave. It was the fact that it was Linda herself, who was supposed to have been buried a week ago. No, that's just impossible. I must be hallucinating because of all the stress, Francis whispered. But no matter how much he rubbed his eyes and slapped his cheeks, the strange vision didn't disappear. Moreover, Linda's doppelganger stood at her own grave and cried. Her grief seemed so sincere that Francis could no longer doubt that it was really happening. Of course, the man didn't know how Linda managed to resurrect, and this question worried him the most. I personally identified her body. There could be no mistake. Francis couldn't sleep even for a moment that night. The woman from the cemetery spent about half an hour at Linda's grave, after which she disappeared in an unknown direction. Most of all, Francis was surprised by the fact that the woman decided to take a trip to the cemetery during the night. He knew that most people wouldn't willingly choose to visit someone's grave at night. Although, if Linda was a ghost, she definitely didn't have a reason to be afraid of otherworldly forces. Determined to find the answers to his question, Francis went to the cemetery gatekeeper the very next morning. The keeper of the peace of the kingdom of the dead turned out to be a bald man of about 60, who patiently listened to the young widower, after which he scratched the top of his head and thought for a moment. It was clear from his face that he took Francis's story seriously. Finally, the gatekeeper made some inner decision and said, "You know, sir, I probably shouldn't be telling you this. The thing is, I know the woman who visits your wife's grave. Her name is Megan. She asked me to take care of the grave and even left her phone number in case of an emergency. I don't know why she did it, but she was very persistent." "Megan, are you sure that's her name?" Francis asked. "I'm sure, sir. If you want, I could call her right now and ask for a meeting," the gatekeeper offered. Francis hesitated for a moment, then accepted the man's offer. The young widower felt very agitated, but patiently waited for the gatekeeper to call his late wife's doppelganger. The time it took for the taxi to arrive at the gatehouse was some of the most emotional in Francis's life. When the passenger opened the door, a woman in jeans, sneakers, and a sweatshirt with the hood thrown over her head stepped out of the car. Francis tensed up visibly, trying to ignore the chills that ran down his spine. The woman stepped closer and pulled off her hood. It was Linda, and Francis knew it. Having noticed her husband, the woman turned pale, after which she motioned for him to step aside. "What's going on, Linda? What's with the spy games?" Francis asked as they walked a considerable distance away from the gatehouse. "For God's sake, keep your voice down." "Yes, it's me, but I have my reasons for hiding," Linda whispered. "Please do share them with me. Richie and I have been grieving all this time, and you're alive and well." It was clear from Linda's face that coming clean was very hard for her. "It's all because of my sister Megan. I never knew anything about her. We got separated as children. We lost our parents and were raised at the orphanage. I hardly remember her. But 2 months ago, Megan found me. At first, our meetings were very friendly, but then Megan started behaving strangely." "Please elaborate." Francis couldn't restrain himself. Linda looked reproachfully at her husband and continued. "Megan started blackmailing me. She demanded money and threatened to take my son away. I made some inquiries and found out that she had served time in prison 3 times. She turned out to be a very dangerous person. Tears in his wife's eyes melted the ice in Francis's heart, as he no longer thought that his wife had simply betrayed their family. But what Linda said next shocked him to the core. I tried to resist, but Megan was very persistent, so I started giving her money. I was hurt and scared, and then she tried to kill me. She lured me out of the city and attacked me from behind. She threw a noose around my neck. I fought with all my might, and I was already losing consciousness when I managed to pick up a big stone. "What did you do, Linda?" Francis asked, already knowing the answer to his question. Linda was sobbing. She dabbed her eyes with the handkerchief and answered. "I hit her as hard as I could, and then Megan went limp and fell to the ground. I got very scared and I didn't want to go to jail. It wasn't my fault, so I decided to switch places with her. And then I started feeling awful about it. I didn't know what to do, so I started coming to my sister's grave and asking for her forgiveness." Francis's face flushed with anger and indignation. "You did nothing wrong, do you hear me? It was self-defense. You had no choice. I'll find the best lawyer in the city, or the state, and even the whole country. But I'll keep you out of jail, do you hear me?" Hugging his wife, Francis knew that he would never let her go again. He fulfilled his promise and hired a group of talented lawyers who made sure Linda was acquitted by the jury. Megan really did have an impressive rap sheet, so it wasn't hard to believe that she could have attacked her own sister. Having reunited with her family, Linda swore that she wouldn't leave them for more than an hour ever again. Little Richie laughed merrily and jumped around his mother like a little kangaroo, while Francis looked gratefully at a miniature surveillance camera that allowed him to solve this extremely complicated case.